Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CISL 650.
Welcome back to the program. Today on The Law Show, we're focusing on immigration law. With us in studio is Gordon Maynard, Rudy Kischer, and Alex Stojicevic, partners all at Maynard Kischer Stojicevic, Immigration and Citizenship Lawyers, here in Vancouver at 1168 Hamilton Street on the 5th floor, and online at vancouverlaw.ca. Wanted to talk about admissibility. Gordon, you raised this matter in our opening segment. It's a big part of immigration law, and I suspect it's a part of immigration law that most of us Canadians who don't deal with immigration law ever probably understand the least. Now we've got January 1st, 2015, a matter of a few days away. So looking forward, Gordon, tell us about who gets into Canada and the changes that are going to happen in a week or so.
Inadmissibility is about people who aren't allowed into Canada.
Okay, fair enough.
And people who are told they have to leave Canada. So if you're here, you get thrown out.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're outside of Canada trying to get in,
there's
a reason why they can say no.
Okay.
Okay. So when you say who gets into Canada and how's that going to change, you're talking about selection. How do we pick our immigrants?
Correct, yeah.
All right. But that's a different issue. You may look at a group of 10 people and say, you all qualify for immigration.
All right.
You're all good economic people. You all look like you can work in Canada. You speak the language. Okay? But maybe 3 of those people have criminality backgrounds.
Okay.
So they have offenses. Those offenses could be a ground of inadmissibility.
Sure.
So you're not allowed in. Or it could be that 2 people out of those 10 on their application didn't tell the truth about something.
Mm-hmm.
If that's found out, now you can be inadmissible for misrepresentation. Maybe one of them has a heart defect. It's going to rise up down the road.
And become a burden on the domestic health care system.
Right. It's going to impose a cost that's greater than the average for the Canadian citizen over a 5-year period.
And that's a category of inadmissibility.
Yep, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay.
So there's about I think it's 9 categories of inadmissibility.
So I should have asked you the question like a civil servant instead of just a curious guy, because the civil servant would want to know. I asked who can get into Canada. They don't care about that. They want to know, and they process people who can't get into Canada. That's their job in some of those people in the immigration department.
Everybody
right?
who applies to come to Canada, whether you're applying as a visitor, student, worker, or immigrant, the overseas office has to assess, are you admissible?
Sure.
Never mind, can we select you in one of those areas? Are you admissible? Once you come to Canada, you may fall afoul of the rules, and now you're inadmissible and can be sent away from Canada.
Okay.
And there's going to be people who come here as students or visitors. They have very few rights in Canada. If they're determined to be inadmissible, it can be done by an officer administratively, and they're told to leave. On the other hand, if you come here as an immigrant, so you may be here as a permanent resident, not yet a citizen, but a permanent resident,
right.
as my dad was for 60 years before he became a citizen, you have a level of rights that's a little bit tougher to take away your status, but certainly doable.
Okay.
So that's the enforcement process.
Okay. So I guess then, looking at the process as Gordon has defined it then, what are the changes coming on January 1st, Alex, that we would go, oh, really?
Well,
It's that different now?
Well, one of the changes that has evolved over time and that is now really in effect already, and January 1st is going to be the only real change there is the level of degree of this. Misrepresentation now is a very, very serious issue.
You mean fudging on your immigration application form?
Any sort of mistake you potentially could make on addresses, travel, anything like that puts you now at risk of an exclusion order. Now, when exclusion orders were developed, they were a 1-year ban from Canada. That's bad, of course, but it's a 1-year ban.
Right.
Now it's a 5-year ban. So if you on an application omit some material information that could have resulted in your application being looked at differently, that means a 5-year exclusion order from Canada potentially.
And Rudy, this is what you were talking about the government losing its heart when it comes to the immigration system. There's no discretion allowed anymore. It's chapter and verse. It's by the book. And if there is a minor error, that could see you put to the back of the queue for 5 years.
Yeah, well, an example of one of the sort of the harshest cases is even if that misrepresentation is something you didn't know about. So there's a case in one of the Federal Court of Canada. A gentleman forgot to declare that he had a child he didn't know about. And the evidence came out. It was clear he didn't know about the child at the time. It didn't matter that he didn't know about the child. The fact that the child wasn't declared meant he had misrepresented. So it doesn't even matter if you know, if you're putting down something that if you're forgetting to put something that you know, that's bad. But even worse, you could be caught by something that you don't even know about.
So
for example, that your spouse put on their application that you didn't know about.
Right. So all the more reason, as you were saying earlier, Gordon, all the more reason for anyone, be it an employer or an individual, wishing to come to Canada or have a potential employee come to Canada, all the more reason to sit down with a lawyer and go through all of these forms, literally line by line, so that you don't encounter that kind of, well, there's a mistake, back of the line, see you in 5 years.
And it's not just individuals, but it's also, and I think Rudy can talk about this, it's also employers who now are faced with very serious consequences to mistakes they make on their forms. I mean, Rudy knows a lot about this.
We're going to talk, but one that comes to mind in terms of mistakes that you talk about going line by line, and one of my favorite lines that took me years to sort of realize the way I've got to ask the question. You say, have you ever been convicted or arrested anywhere? And typical response is no. So somebody's in their 50s, they forget about what they did in their 20s. Right. It was a bad memory. It was a foggy time. So the way I structure my question is, have you ever talked to a police officer? Then they look at you kind of odd. Well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, have you ever talked to a police officer? Then they started going, well, there was that time I was handcuffed. Were you? Well, I didn't think I was arrested because I wasn't fingerprinted. I'm like, we should probably disclose all this to make sure we don't have any issues.
Right.
My favorite one of those is, if I may, gentlemen. So have you ever been a member of any types of organizations, like recreational organizations? What do you mean, like a bike club? Sure, yeah, that could be a recreational organization. Right. Yeah, so I'm a full patch Hells Angel.
Well,
that came off of Recreation Club.
Here I am imagining a bunch of cyclists on the seawall in Stanley Park. That's very funny.
Different people interpret that question very differently.
I'll bet they do. There was a time when we established a quota here in Canada that we were going to accept 250,000 immigrants per year indefinitely. Are we still on target, Rudy? Is that still our target number year after year?
Yeah, that is still they call it, they've always resisted calling it a quota. They've always called it a target because they don't want to see that they have quota in people. But we're still on target. I mean, what you've got to realize, Canada has there's an endless demand for Canada out there. There's no question that, that people want to come here, and the government's still on target to sort of immigrate 250,000 a year, which they have done pretty consistently since about 1990.
Okay, so Gordon, of the 250,000 people that we accept every year, what percentage of those people played the game by the rules? They went to the Canadian Immigration Office in their home country. They got the paperwork. They filed the paperwork. They've done everything according to the book. What percentage of that 250,000 would those people represent versus refugees and immigrants from other categories?
The 250,000 is everybody that makes it into Canada. So if you're talking about a family of 4, that was maybe one applicant with the accompanying family member.
Okay,
so it's not 250 individuals all individually applying.
Okay.
The vast majority of those are going to be economic immigrants who have come in through an economic selection process.
Looking for a better life, the classic reason, right?
No, when I say economic, I mean a category of immigrant selection.
Explain, please?
Well, Canada has moved towards a policy where the majority of the immigrants that come into Canada are selected on an economic basis.
Okay.
So they look for parameters that indicate that the person will be economically successful in Canada. So they look at age, education, language ability, work experience, okay, and they whether or not you have a job ready for you in Canada. Right?
Does that matter? Does that matter more now than ever before if you are employable?
That is the change that's going to. When you asked your question earlier about enforcement, you were saying, what about these changes in January? The changes in January are about the selection process, the selection of immigrants, and in particular in the economic category. That's the express entry.
Okay.
But to get back to the immediate question, so you have economic class, which is probably, I don't know the exact figure, we would say about 60% of
They're
our
shooting
immigration.
for 70 now.
Yeah. Okay.
That used to be 50-50 years ago.
Oh, it used to be 60-40 family.
60-40 family, exactly. And that's now the other way around.
Okay.
So then the other side of that is family reunification, which is bringing in your spouse, your children, your parents, your grandparents. And that's not done on an economic basis, or it wasn't done on an economic basis. There was an idea that families should be allowed to reunite in Canada. So if you had an immigrant in Canada, they should be able to bring over their family members. Well, when I started in immigration law, that represented 60% of our immigration, because we also gave big family points and called it part of the economic category.
Okay.
They got rid of those points. They raised the standard for being a sponsor. They made many changes through the regulations, and now family immigration really represents a minority of our immigration to Canada. Now, then you come to the refugees, who are either selected overseas, or they come to Canada and they make their claims within Canada and are selected that way.
Who makes the selections overseas? Would it be the United Nations Commission for Refugees, or do we have overseas immigration staff who would make those selections?
We use the United Nations to help designate whether or not somebody's a UNHCR refugee.
Okay.
Rudy's more familiar with this because he worked in the system overseas.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. I worked as a consultant based in Hong Kong, resettling immigrants, resettling refugees that had been certified, basically decided by UNHCR, obviously, that this person is fleeing
clearly a refugee,
fleeing persecution, designated as fleeing persecution, and therefore certain governments, the United States and Canada being the largest, if you want to call them donor countries or settlement countries, that said we will take those refugees from overseas, and we only take out of that settlement about 10,000 a year.
That's a number I'm familiar with.
So very small. When you talk about 250,000, the amount that sort of are selected from UNHCR overseas that Canada then says we will take those is about 10,000 a year out of 250,000.
And then what's the number this year for, or the most recent annual year, what's the number for applications by persons within Canada for refugee status and accepted?
7 or 8 years ago, that number was in the 30,000, 35,000 applicants, and say half of those would get refugee status. Now the numbers are quite a bit smaller. They're less than half in terms of the applicant numbers, and it's maybe 40% of those that are accepted. Okay. So the number accepted is probably a third of what it was 7 or 8 years ago. And that's a product of massive changes to refugee processing in Canada.
Okay.
Right. We have people stationed overseas in airports to prevent refugee claimants from coming to Canada.
Bogus refugee claims, right?
People who are improperly documented. There's no decision made at the airport as to whether or not they're bogus refugees.
Okay.
There's only a decision made as to whether or not they have proper documents.
Okay.
So improperly documented people don't get on the plane.
Yeah.
That's a way of controlling who comes here to make refugee claims.
And that's become very effective. I mean, over the years, these migration control officers that Canada Border Services has paid for have prevented untold thousands who would have otherwise come to Canada from coming to Canada.
Interesting. I suppose, Gordon, when you mentioned the economic class of refugee, I went in my mind immediately to a place a lot of Canadians go to, and it was the wrong place. But I'm easily confused when it comes to immigration law, as most of us are.
That's because critics of, for instance, the refugee selection process, people who wanted to say that refugees in Canada are taking advantage of our good nature, and wanted to see stricter rules, they would say that they're really coming here to improve their economic lot, that they're not really coming here for safety. And so they would paint these people as being bogus in the sense that they're really coming here for economic benefit.
Right, and the refugee is a bit of a scam. The refugee story is a bit of a...
And look, to be perfectly clear, there's no doubt that refugee claimants, some who come to Canada, are bogus.
Sure.
There's also no doubt that some who come to Canada are absolutely in need of protection, and we need to have a system to make sure they separate the wheat from the chaff.
Exactly. But Alex, I suppose what I was talking about, though, is I'm going back to the Mulrooney era. Brian Mulroney, as Prime Minister of Canada, initiated this thing where foreigners could buy Canadian citizenship. I thought it was $500,000. I have since learned that it was $100,000. It was the most depressing news I heard in my life at that time. Canadian citizenship worth its weight in gold anywhere on the planet. It was for sale for $100,000. Now, we still have investors and business class people who can buy their way into Canada. What's the tab these days?
Well, it's hard to say because we're not entirely sure where the government is going with their current round of changes. I mean, how the system, what happened last year is that all existing applicants in the federal investor program had their applications canceled. The reality is they haven't been taking applications in the federal portion of the investor program since July of 2011, which was the year they changed the number from you had to invest $200,000 and increase that. You had to invest $400,000 and have a net worth of $800,000, and change that number to $800,000 as the investment amount, and $1.6 million as your net worth number.
Okay.
Now, they haven't taken any new applications since July of 2011, but their backlog, particularly in Hong Kong and in Beijing, was so long, close to 10,000 applications apparently,
right,
that they were still, settling more than 12 or 1,400 families a year under that category, processing them annually. What happened last year is they canceled the program entirely and refunded all of the remaining backlog members and just gave them their money back.
Oh.
The challenge in the system has been this. The idea behind the investor program from Mulroney's time till now was to, and originally it was $250,000 was the envisioned amount. Mm-hmm. Later that became $400,000 in the 90s, in the late 1990s. The vision was, hey, we're going to create a pool of venture capital that supplements Canada's financial system. So we're going to use this immigrant capital as new capital to lend in situations where the banks would not lend.
True. Yep.
Okay? That was the idea.
Yep.
But in reality, what happened is that there were opportunities created by which many financial institutions in Canada could actually lend the immigrant a lot of the money themselves. And the government saw this, eventually came around to realizing that really this wasn't a lot of new money coming into Canada. This was a lot of existing Canadian money just swishing
going around and around. Sure.
I mean, most of the immigrants came with loans from banks to put up the money for the immigrant program itself. Mm-hmm. So in a way, it really didn't achieve its venture capital goals. So the newest version of it, a pilot that the government has just announced, they will take 50 applications where people will have to put up $2 million each. But that's just 50 applicants. That's all. You'll have to have a net worth in the multiple millions, and you'll have to put up $2 million. But they're limiting this to literally 50 applications in the first year. So it's not a lot of people who will be able to come in through this. Quebec, however, still has its investor program, and its investor program still gets to take in 1,750 applicants next year. And I should add that...
And what do they have to pony up? If the new
it's
rule is 2 million?
800,000 is how much they have to put up.
Okay.
Special rules for Quebec.
Special rules for Quebec. 800,000 and 1.6 million is the net worth. There's a rule in Quebec now that no more than 1,200 applicants can come from a single country. And that's a rule really because the demand from China has been so much greater than anywhere else.
Right, and we'll talk about that in the next segment, too, especially as it pertains to us here in BC.
The challenge, of course, with Quebec's program and the effect that it has on British Columbia is that traditionally the vast majority of the Quebec-bound investor immigrants have moved to Vancouver.
Yes. They stay the minimum that they have to stay in Quebec to satisfy their getting there in the first place. And as soon as that last day expires, they are on a train, plane, or whatever, the heck out of Quebec. And a lot of them, you're quite right, live here in Vancouver. Very interesting stuff. We're talking immigration law. Our guests are in studio are Gordon Maynard, Rudy Kischer, and Alex Stojicevic from... Maynard Kischer Stojicevic, immigration and citizenship lawyers in Vancouver. Online at vancouverlaw.ca. Check them out while we take this quick break on The Law Show on CISL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CISL 650.